is on. If you could let us know.
not.
Can you hear me in the back?
Kind of on, but not real loud.
Try it again. How about this? Well, welcome to our monthly luncheon. I think we're coming in here.
Yeah.
For those of you I haven't met, I'm Rose Johnson, co-president. Julie Castle's not able to be with us today, so we want to welcome you to our luncheon. And I'd like to call on a few of our members just to give you some updates. We had a massive voter registration effort last month, and I'm going to ask Shirley Island to come up and tell you a little bit about that.
We had a really good time at South Alabama and Spring Hill College last month. We registered around 99, I think, and Art Walk last month. We did 9 people. We were at Climate Rise, so we have been really busy. And I'd like for everyone who volunteered to help register voters to please raise your hand since you're still eating a lunch. Thank you. This Friday, we will be at the Tolmanville Public Library from 3 to 5, and we'll be at the History Museum from 5 till 9. So busy time, and we'll be at Art Walk every month, and that's the second Friday. And I think Myra has had some school activity you might want to include.
We were at Baker just this morning, 2 more classes, in addition to the 6, 8 we did last month, and we're going to Williamson tomorrow if anybody wants to go, and we'll be out at Mary G. Montgomery on Monday. So we are working. Primary is March 3rd. We want all the eligible 18-year-olds to be registered and excited to show up.
Yay.
Thank you, Myra. Thank you, Shirley.
And I forgot, a shout out to Betty Shen for coordinating registration at LaFleur. So thank you.
And Betty, I hear you had quite a number of registered there as well.
Yeah, we did. I can't remember the number now. Belinda.
40-something.
40 at the floor. Thank you for that. A few other announcements before we hear from our speaker. If you'll remember, we have agreed that we were going to experiment with an evening lunch, and I know this is an oxymoron, so bear with me. November 11th is our next study group, and November 13th in the evening, 5:45. You'll be seeing this in Happenings, and again online, but just want to let those of you that attend regularly understand that we're going to be meeting in the evening next month. So thanks to you for coming today and coming next month in the evening. We'll see how well that works. We want to just reach out and reach others that are not able to come through the day, so it's our effort to expand our participation as much as possible. Also, I just wanted to give you a brief update on the Centennial. Belinda, are you raising your hand back there? Well, Linda, as you know, is our VP in membership, and she wanted to let everyone know we are now at 133, so we continue to enroll in members. Thank you, Belinda. And we're happy to see Tom back. Tom Holmes has been away, taking care of some personal business, but he's on the mend now. We're happy to have you back, and thank you for all you're doing as treasurer, Tom. I see another hand in the back. Yes, thank you for bringing that up. Yes, the evening meeting will be here, 5:45 Heron Lakes on the 13th. And another quick update on Centennial. We are continuing to meet with our local Centennial Committee, and I was able to attend the state board meeting this past Saturday with Mary Ann and Barbara Goodell, and the state is also making plans. April 25th of 2020 will be our state council meeting, and there will be some special activities to commemorate the Centennial in Montgomery, but you'll be hearing more about that. But we want to encourage everyone to put it on your calendar and make plans to attend. Our Centennial Committee will be meeting Monday the 29th at 5:30 at Kelly Finley's office. So I want to remind and invite those that have been part of the committee and anyone else who would like to participate. We'd love to have you. We have several events that we're working toward and want to get as much participation and input as possible. Any other announcements for the good of the cause? Myra.
We are streaming this. We have been streaming our luncheon, so going forward, if you have people you want to encourage to drop in on us, you might want to do that. And I understand some of you are struggling with MailChimp. Please, we haven't changed anything. I think it was a recent update perhaps through your computer. Look in your spam box, and if you haven't seen it, and I'll single her out, Erin sent me an email that said I can't find it, and we were able to figure it out. So please look for it. It's coming out by the 3rd of each month. And if you haven't seen it, look in your spam box.
Thank you, Myra. Donna, I'd like to invite Donna Rogers to come forward as program chair and introduce our speaker.
And prior to introducing our speaker, I want to just remind everyone, we are focusing on the topic of media and politics through this fall, September, October, and next month. Last month we had more of a general overview of the integration of politics into media. This month we're focusing on social media and politics, and next month we'll be focusing more on local media and so forth. And also one little PS about the evening, our dinner meeting next month. If you have transportation issues, please let us know. We'll try our best to accommodate if that is a reason why you're unable to make an evening meeting. If you have other problems, don't let me know. At this point, I'm really pleased to introduce to you Dr. Philip Habel, who is the chairman of the Department of Political Science and Criminal Justice. Before coming to South Alabama, he taught, get this, at the University of Glasgow in Scotland. So I don't know if he'll have a brogue today. He earned his BA from Washington University, and he earned his PhD from the University of Illinois. Dr. Habel, thank you so much for coming today.
Thanks for having me. It's really an honor to be here, and I look forward to meeting. I've met several already, and look forward to meeting more of you today. So I have a lot for you today, and I think my sense is that there's a lot of things to think about, and some will probably stay with you for a while, and other things will be forgotten quickly, and that's fine. But hopefully there's a little bit for everyone here, some things to reflect on and think about. And so just briefly about me, thanks for the kind introduction. I'm Associate Professor and Chair at South of the Department of Political Science and Criminal Justice. And my interests have been in media and political communication, and particularly I'm interested in questions about the nature of influence, relationships, and dynamics. And so questions like who influences whom, and within that, what's the quality of information that people receive. I was also privileged to be part of an effort by New York University that was a global project funding 6 conferences around the world at various NYU campuses. So we were 3 times in the fall at New York, and then the others were at Abu Dhabi, Shanghai, and Florence, Italy. And so those are really it's always nice when someone's funding a trip overseas. And so this was a really nice opportunity. It's just actually a lot of the work that I'm going to talk about today is published by that group of people as well as some others. So I want to start with a really basic question, and that is, are social media democratizing politics? And the way that some scholars have thought about that is, are they redistributing political influence? Are they broadening the so-called public sphere of communication? Do we see an increase in political participation? And as Hinman says, first and foremost, that the technology will amplify the political voice of ordinary citizens. Now, I've done several talks at luncheons before, and I realize if you're the speaker before luncheon, everyone is waiting for you to finish so that they can eat. If you're the speaker after lunch, everyone gets a little bit tired, and it's a good time for coffee. So I want to turn this question to make sure that we keep everybody kind of going and awake. I actually want to turn this question over to your tables for a moment and get kind of a quick sense. Would you generally perceive social media as a force for good in our democracy, or are you very much concerned about what you see and hear going on social media, or are there reasons for both? And so we'll talk about this kind of, should we be optimistic, should we be pessimistic, should we be concerned? But let me turn that quickly to your tables for about a 2 to 3 minute conversation, maybe a kind of going around and getting a sense, are social media democratizing politics is an enormously good thing, or are we concerned?
Man, Gina? What do you think?
I think there's both.
That's,
There's
yeah.
good and bad.
Yeah.
A lot of voices that weren't heard before are heard and amplified, and then you have a lot of scary things happening, and
Not knowing who's
and the
real and not.
professional journalists have got to find some way. I mean, and Mobile's a great example of, with the loss of daily newspaper coverage, to work in this new model and get paid.
Yeah.
And do you think any one form of social media has more influence than another? I mean, I don't do Twitter or Instagram, so I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, I know as a journalist, a former journalist, you used to like
So maybe about another 30 seconds to a minute.
people would to have a quote from someone. Now you can go and make your own quote and just put it out there, and so that's definitely two-sided.
Yes. And I'm wondering too, how many people with social media are prone to searching out their own preferences. And so your own viewpoint is simply reinforced. Yeah, I do that. I like it. I'll hear my
Is there
opinion.
one person who could maybe summarize quickly the discussions at each of your respective tables? How about, thank you, sure. Yes, please, yeah.
Well, we were talking, first of all, one of the questions, we were assuming you were talking about specifically our country.
Yeah, that's fine, but we'll talk a bit globally too today.
Because we were talking about both, but, you know, it's, and I think just from watching everyone's head nod and things like that, that everyone was like, oh my God, yes, we're concerned, because
Okay.
everyone is concerned, right? But the thing is, it can be a good thing, it can be a bad thing. What's happened is it's turned into a hate sounding board for so many people to just go out there and whatever. But someone else mentioned it's also great, it's particularly globally in other countries, for people who are trying to organize and get politics. You know, it depends on how you use it. Is it good or is it bad? You know, basically, if they could monitor the dim-wittedness of people on there. Sorry, but you know what I'm talking about, unless it's you guys, and I think you're wonderful. But you know what I'm saying. It's not just something out there for people to just say, I hate this person or I hate that person or whatever. It's out there for people if they could actually have discussions. Because I have a friend who's very vocal.
Sure.
And I will private message him and say, look, I need some education on this without the editorializing. Just give me some black and whites on it. And he will. You know, but I think we all see that people are out there who are just like ready to, frankly, I don't understand why they don't have like the FBI at their door the next day making comments and threats that are what could be interpreted as threats. And so like I say, is it good or is it bad? That depends on who's reading and who's rocking.
Okay, just maybe really quickly, one or two more comments too. Marie, thanks.
One quick comment.
Yeah, please.
I was in Iran when Khomeini was trying to get a foothold there.
Right.
And there was no social media like it. But you know what he did was he had little audio cassettes and made these speeches on them and sent them over the border because he had been exiled. And I thought that's interesting in early beginnings, I guess.
Yeah, right. No, that's right. Yes, please.
I think, though, in terms of democratizing it, a good thing is the level of access.
Good.
The access that constituents have to their elected officials by contacting them through social media or whoever holds their device, you're contacting that person. And it offers the politicians an opportunity to find out what their constituents believe because of the things that they're posting. So
Absolutely.
the two-way access, I think, is a good thing.
Good. This is fabulous. You've all are officially now invited to guest lecture on my social media politics course because you've really hit on, in effect, a semester's worth of material. And I'll try not to give you a semester's worth of material here this morning, but I will hit a number of studies. And there, as you speak, I think there are more that I maybe should include that aren't here, but we'll at least, like I said, what your appetite. So one of the questions that you came to me was, what exactly are social media? And so what are the platforms that people are using? And I think you'll recognize the common ones. For most people, Facebook is still the most ubiquitous of the social media platforms. Started in 2004. But YouTube is another that's been around for a long time that maybe we don't think about in the same way as we think about Facebook and Twitter. So Twitter, again, 2007. Instagram is really popular. If you're asking my college students today, many of them actually will use Instagram and Snapchat and not so much Facebook anymore. Twitter is still really the domain that's used principally by journalists, politicians, elites more generally, as well as the public at large. Pinterest, I think many of you know too, are just some examples. So how do academics define it? Really involves the posting of online content by individuals, the personal and free choice of individuals to select the kind of network on which to embed themselves, and then commenting on information on other posts and possibly a degree of privacy or anonymity. So it's this idea of this interaction that defines it or differentiates it from, say, early internet in the early 2000s, where we didn't have this back and forth opportunities. So I really I'm going to kind of anchor to some of what I'm going to talk about today that fits very well with the comments that were made in an article by this team at NYU, led by Josh Tucker and others, in a piece they wrote in 2017 in Journal of Democracy that frames social media creatively through the Star Wars series of movies. So there's a bit of a metaphor in each one. But they talk about the idea that social media can be liberating. And so several of you have raised the concerns and prospects for social media and authoritarian systems, that this is an opportunity for people to speak openly in ways that they could not before. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. There's also the concern about repression technology. So in these same countries and regimes, the use of social media and other tools to stifle democratic action on the part of the citizenry. There's also the concern about what they label tumultuous technology, which is, say, bots and incivility, and really, now we're not talking about state-level actors, not countries, or not politicians, but rather kind of third-party entities and their ability to manipulate the social media environment. And so they can do this by the creation of bots, which I'll talk about later, which can post information. And so this was a concern, remember back to the 2016 election, and Russian actors and others posting information into social media sites. And then finally, this kind of question that still remains is restricting technology. To what extent do we see efforts, even in democratic countries, on the parts of governments or companies to quote-unquote censor information, and to what extent? And so that's a discussion that we're having right now. If you've seen recently with Elizabeth Warren, she's posted a campaign ad that has deliberate information that's false regarding Mark Zuckerberg onto Facebook to see how Facebook would respond to that, right? And so we have these kind of normative debates about to what extent should Facebook as a company intervene and censor information, or to what extent should they allow a free flow of communication. And I think in the room, if we went around, we would see differences of views on that very point. Okay, so I also recently wrote a piece for a chapter in a volume published by Oxford University Press with the co-author Yanis Theochris, who's in Germany, talking about another framework for understanding social media, which is really suppliers of information and demand side from the audience. And so what are, for example, politicians, elites, journalists, and the like, how are they using social media tools to communicate with their audience? We know President Trump is a very active Twitter user, right? And so he certainly uses that forum regularly. On demand side, how are citizens using the forum to, as Pamela mentioned, communicate with their elected actors and raise issues that they otherwise maybe wouldn't have been able to? Okay, so going back a few years, again, I'm going to give you kind of three approaches. One is this idea of the grounded in the Star Wars trilogy of liberation, restricting tumultuous and repressive technology. Ours thinks about supply and demand, but an even earlier one thinks about these three aspects of social media in particular: the opportunities for free speech, of course, so again, this resonates. The ideas of their lower cost to collective action. As you know, when you're trying to get a hold of someone, it's a lot easier to text message these days than it was in an earlier time to call somebody on the phone and try to get them, right? A quick text will accomplish quite a bit. And we know that in the context of protests, that people are using text messaging and also platforms like Twitter to communicate views and to encourage people to turn out. And finally, there's a concept, it's a Greek word called homophily. And again, all of these could have both positive and negative attributes to them. Homophily is the idea that we find ourselves associated with those with whom we share an interest. And so you're all part of the League of Women Voters. What got you together was some interest in the issues that the League cares about. And so that's this idea of homophily. You could all at the same time be interested in something democratically not good and not pleasing, right? And so we could see trolls and people trying to use these platforms for abusive purposes. This raises the idea of echo chambers. You've probably heard this idea that people become embedded in a certain discussion network online where all they hear are views that resonate with themselves. Maybe some of you, like myself, have, this is being live tweeted, I have to be careful about what I say about family members, but maybe you have some others whom you know who at times share information. You think, oh, that's quite interesting. I didn't think about that issue before that way. Chances are it's being shared among a network of like-minded citizens. All right, so let me tell you a little bit about, so I said I'll do some kind of U.S. and some global perspectives as well. How about starting with the supplier's perspective? How many world leaders use social media? And so a study by Barbera and Zaitsev in 2018 noted that about basically half of world leaders have either a personal account or a government account. And so the way that you can differentiate this, think about President Trump. He's got his own personal Twitter account that he tweets from. There's also a White House Twitter account, which we think about as an institutional account. That's quite a bit. It's not, maybe you thought higher, maybe you thought lower, but you think globally, that's about half of world leaders who are using Facebook. How do they use it? Maybe no surprise, they use it for position taking and announcing what they're doing. They at times tweet about their personal lives. They at times use it to communicate with international audiences. And they also use it for what scholars call cheerleading, which could be at times distracting and shifting the agenda. So Dr. Bunch, I'm sure, introduced to you last month this idea of agenda setting. The media play a powerful role in dictating the things that are on our minds. And so they can use it to kind of shift the narrative away from, say, those protesters on the street who are attracting global media attention. This is actually a map. The countries in dark gray are entities where the leader of the respective country uses a social media platform. Light gray is non-use. So you can, get a sense this is a good part of the world is covered. How about this question of what do you think about social media? Now we'll turn the attention back to citizens. So this is kind of came up a little bit in your tables. Do the news media more generally, and do social media do a good job of distinguishing fact from fiction? So again, in this kind of era of concerns about fake news, you'll see there's not a lot of confidence in the news media more generally in no country. And these are our European counterparts, and Australia's in there as well. In no country do we see a majority of citizens who say the news media does a good job in distinguishing fact from fiction. So media trust on the whole is not great by that standard. Interestingly, Greece is the one context when the study was done in 2017 where more people said social media does a good job in distinguishing fact from fiction than the news media more generally. Why do people agree that social media now does a good job in help distinguishing fact from fiction? Again, it's for some of the reasons that you articulated. Social media has a broader range of views and sources. 33% said that. There's a level of authenticity that people are expressing what's on their minds. Why are they concerned about social media? Well, there's concerns about the quality and the unreliability of information. And more than a third of people referenced that as a concern about the news and information. While they said authenticity can be a positive, there also are no checks on authenticity on social media. And so other things you see that they mention, like clickbait, this idea of trying to bring you in to click on a story. Lots of times if you're at a website, on the margins, you'll see these stories that sound, if I only did this, I would lose all the weight that I just gained with that delicious coconut pie. I click on that and it takes me away to somewhere else, right? This so-called clickbait. How about then, let's talk a little bit about political knowledge. And so scholars for a long time have said there's real value in political knowledge. I think that goes without saying in this room, that the more informed you are, the better decisions you'll make at the ballot box, the more you're able to communicate to your leaders and elected officials your ideas and preferences. And so scholars have said, in this increasing era of polarization, where politicians are more divided and the public as well, maybe social media has something to do with this, that we're in these echo chambers, that we only click on information that comports with what we believe, we avoid the stuff, we disregard the stuff that looks otherwise. And so you can contrast today's environment to an early generation. Maybe this picture looks vaguely familiar. I still can remember having one of those RCA boxes around the house because my parents didn't want to invest in a nicer TV. Chances are, if you remember this, you notice that there's one channel on and the family was kind of wrapped around the television, and at 5 o'clock in the evening the news was on and there really weren't any other choices. Today, we have unparalleled choice. Right? If you ask students, they'll tell you they have upwards of several hundred cable channels to choose from, and that's just television. That's not even touching what's available to them on their phones. So one can navigate away from political information, or one can navigate toward it. And so one of the key things that we'll talk about today is this idea of political interest. In an earlier generation, we could learn passively, the news would be on, that's all that was on. Today we don't have that luxury. Citizens have to either avail themselves of the opportunities and affordances of what's there and learning more about politics, or can choose entertainment. And for most, we know that most will choose entertainment in these contexts. So again, there's going to be some positive things today. There'll be some things for concern as we go. This, by the way, is also interesting. This also affects, when we think about these echo chambers and selective exposure, this also has implications for our members of Congress. And so here are effectively a way of measuring how liberal or conservative a given member of Congress is. This is really a brilliant study that Pew did last year. And so if you're far to the left here, you're quite liberal. If you're far to the right, you're quite conservative. And here this is the middle ground, right? Those on the far right and far left, when they tweet or when they post on Facebook and post a link to the news, they tend to grab from very decided and what we would say in our minds, recognizable sources that have a liberal or conservative bent to them. So among conservatives, among kind of far-right conservatives, we see Daily Signal, Breitbart.com, National Review, Daily Caller, Free Beacon, Washington Times, Fox News as the top sources when they're sharing information. Among liberals, thinkprogress.org, Vox.com, Huffington Post, New York Times, NPR. Right? So even members of Congress, when they share information, if they're decidedly liberal or conservative, are more likely to share from specific sources than those in the middle. Okay, let's talk a little bit about fake news. So if we go back, this is a working paper by some friends of mine, and they're looking at really kind of this interesting combination that we're seeing more of with survey data and actual people's behaviors as they're clicking through information. And what they found is, looking back at the 2016 election, that for the most part what we saw is when people circulated and shared fake news and information, it tended to be people on the extremes. So if you were more liberal or more conservative, you were more inclined or more likely to be sharing fake news information. And you see this particularly on this slide here. It was also the case that there was more sharing of fake news, and again, this might be a context of the nature of the 2016 election, so I don't want to harp on this point, but there was more sharing of fake news by pro-Trump supporters than by pro-Clinton supporters. It wasn't there's no absence of in either case, but there was more among pro-Trump supporters than among pro-Clinton supporters. A really interesting study that appeared in Science, which is not only a social science but a journal across the sciences, examined the diffusion of fake news versus news that resembles in some ways fake news. I actually think it's quite brilliant research design. If you're familiar with sites like factcheck.org or Snopes, right, they're these ones who kind of tell you, is this story true or not true? And sometimes if you see something there, you go, hey, wait, that sounds false. Actually, that is true. Okay, wow, that surprised me. Or this one sounds true. And, right, so they provide this really useful source of fact-checking of information online. What they did is these authors went to those sites and effectively harvested all the stories that the sites had categorized as fake news, false news in their language, And the ones that they categorized as true. So again, the kind of thing that looks like, oh, there might be something to this, but it actually turns out to be true. And the ones that were mixed, which is a number of stories, right, that have some truth to them and some hearsay. Armed with that set of data, they went to Twitter and they looked at the spread of that information from the period 2006 to 2017. That's 126,000 rumor cascades shared by more than 3 million people, more than 4.5 million times. So lots of information. Again, this is just the kind of stuff that makes it to Snopes and Fact Checker and the like. What's the punchline of this fancy figure? I won't go through this one just for sake of time. But what they find is that, I'll summarize this, fake news, here's again one of the kind of like be a little concerned today. Fake news spreads faster than true or mixed news, right? Fake news spreads faster. It spreads further, so the rate of the speed and the way in which it travels spreads further, and they call these cascades. And information about politics was the most common among these fake news, rumors, and cascades. We estimated a model that said falsehoods were 70% more likely to be retweeted than the truth in these contexts. So there is, maybe in our minds, an alarming amount of untrue information traveling around social media circles. Okay, how about the next kind of thing that scares us? What about bots? And what are bots? So you may have heard this term before. You may have heard the term algorithms, which go hand in hand. They're a bit different, but an algorithm, or sorry, a bot is a software that automates the interaction between a user and content of other users. So you could say a bot, you could train a bot on Twitter to say when someone posts something on of this theme, they post on University of South Alabama, a bot comes out and says, we saw that you posted on University of South Alabama, we'd invite you to come visit our campus or something, right? So they could be good bots, they could be bad bots, right? And the like. An algorithm similarly will be something like if you just started Google searching a nice gift for your daughter or granddaughter, it recognizes the kinds of things you search, and then on the sidebar you're going to see advertisements in the future for those very same items. So again, bots are a concern. How about censorship more generally? And so again, bots, we can think about this in both democratic and non-democratic contexts. Fake news, we're obviously concerned about cross-context. How about censorship? And this particularly we think about in authoritarian contexts. And so there's a really excellent book by Molly Roberts called Censorship, in fact. And she was part of this group that I mentioned before from NYU. And so she defines, I think, censorship in a really helpful way. It's a broad definition, restriction of the public expression or public access to information by authority when the information is thought to have the capacity to undermine authority, making it accountable to the public. So this idea of restricting information, particularly under these sets of circumstances where authorities are worried that if the information gets out, they'll be more accountable, right? And so you can see authoritarian context, if this would be true. You can also see at times politically where actors would want to, here in the United States, actors might want to keep certain information from coming out. So how does a place like China, which is where her research is based, how does a place like China do this? And if you think about media access in China, if you've ever traveled there, by the way, it was really kind of fascinating to hear this presented, some of this research presented in Shanghai as part of the conference when we're talking about use of media technology. But as we're there, right, and if you traveled in China, you know this, right? You try to jump on Google and it's not there. You maybe try to get access to certain news sites like the New York Times or the Guardian or the BBC, and you can't get access to any of those, right? China has the so-called Great Firewall. And what that does is create real friction. So governments stepping in and not completely cutting off. There are a lot of people who use VPNs and other ways of circumventing, but it takes more time and patience to get through. I was happy finally when I got to my Gmail so that I could answer some emails in a creative way, right? One has to be willing to endure that extra cost to overcome the friction, the roadblock set in place to find information. So one way that regimes can impede information is setting up these kinds of roadblocks. Another way is simply fear. And what's interesting about her work in China, this is the most common way we think about censorship. If I say something wrong, I could be arrested. That's used less commonly in China than we might conventionally think. Friction and flooding are the more common strategies used by the leaders. Flooding then is when, say that a protest breaks out or something's happening politically that would be a threat to the leadership, you then flood social media and media information environments with lots of superfluous, sometimes useless information to kind of drown out the budding protest that's happening, right? And so these are if you think about friction and flooding, these are the strategies particularly that the government in China deploys when, and especially under context, flooding, especially under context where protests are beginning to happen, when there's concerned protests. Okay, I've got to check how I'm doing on time here. I'm okay? All right.
Yep.
Let's talk a little bit about, we'll shift gears now. So I really have talked so far about fake news and bots. I've talked a bit about censorship. I want to talk about polarization. Again, this idea back to homophily, that we kind of find ourselves talking about issues with those with whom we agree. If we find that maybe it's family, maybe it's friends, we disagree, we don't engage as much, right? And we do this offline, like think about your Thanksgiving table, right? And we do it online, think about those with whom you correspond with about politics. And behind our backs, I'm working with a student right now on an honors project, and she's got a really great new set of public opinion survey data. And one of her first findings is that 30% of people on Facebook have either unfriended or blocked someone whose political views have differed from theirs. Maybe you have done just the same. You saw something on Facebook and you said unfollow or unfriend or block. It's about 30% of us who have done that. Now, in some ways, we might say that's not a bad thing. We don't want to be frustrated, especially if we think the person's dead wrong. At the same time, right, that does change our information environment. It restricts it, narrows the kinds of views that we might see. So these authors looked in a study in 2015 involving millions of tweets at several different issues that were happening at the time. So this is across a period of years. So they began with 2012, looking at the presidential campaign, and harvested 60 million tweets, all the way to about 2014. And they found that certain issues, no surprise, particularly political ones, were much more polarized than non-political issues. So with a strategy for identifying if someone was a Republican or a Democrat, liberal or conservative on social media, they were able to look at individuals and then look at the kinds of things they tweeted about and with whom they tweeted. And so things like the government shutdown at that time were highly polarized. Conversations like the minimum wage, no surprise, the election is highly polarized. Again, liberals are mostly tweeting with liberals, conservatives are mostly tweeting with conservatives. If you look at so-called even evolving political issues, things like there was a school shooting at that time, you can see that there's actually polarization very early on, and it grows over time. I won't show you that slide. But other things, the Winter Olympics, we might be just as prone to retweet a Republican as a Democrat without knowing. So to give you a sense of what the Twitter network looks like, this is the 2012 election, right? Here's Republicans, kind of conservatives speaking with conservatives. Here's liberals speaking with liberals. Here's some cross-cutting information, right? People are tweeting across. Whether they're actually communicating with each other or whether they're just trolling the opposition is a whole nother matter. This is what the Super Bowl looks like, right? This is a non-polarized discussion network where people are talking with everyone across a set. Now, if we looked at it by football team, we'd see polarization, I'm sure. But just a general discussion, liberals and conservatives are communicating. This is the one, I did have the slide for this, where you see something like the Newtown shooting growing increasingly polarized from the moment it happens till about 30 days later. This is a kind of level of polarization. 2012 election, highest, pretty standard. Even the Boston Marathon, if you recall, that was the instance where the bombing took place at that time, gets more polarized as the discussion continues online. Okay, I'm going to skip this slide. I've got a lot there for you. Let's talk a little bit about incivility. So we talked about polarization now. Let me kind of move the discussion to incivility. This is always a bad strategy when you're making a presentation. You should never show a slide that dates to the morning of your presentation, because then people wonder, did you really spend a lot of time presenting it? But this is preparing it. But this is President Trump's tweet as of about 6:40 this morning. He says Republicans are totally deprived of their rights in this impeachment witch hunt. No lawyers, no questions, no transparency. The good news is the radical left ends with no case, right? And what's happened with President Trump especially is that the moment he tweets, there's a competition, particularly among his opponents, to be among the first to reply back, typically in a very uncivil fashion. And so I've blocked out some of the swear words that are kind of throughout here in response to this tweet. Now, in fairness, like this one kind of includes a link to a legitimate news story, and like there's one here that you can't read, but like tries to engage what the president's saying by giving another reply to it, right? But a number of these are just simply incivil, swearing back at the president for what he's just tweeted. Okay, please. Yeah.
I have a question on that. And this is, again, not to say whose side or who, whatever. But I mentioned that earlier, that again, I have a friend of mine who posts things that, and I've seen it across the board since we had the election. And I don't understand how the words assassinate and president can flow across social media, even if they're saying he'll be assassinated, or with any luck he'll be assassinated, or whatever. I don't see how that can flow across social media and something not pop up as a red flag.
Right. Well, it certainly can. Yeah.
I mean,
so,
and yet, I mean, I know these folks that have done that. These are people that I know. I don't just mean like Fred Jones. I hope he's not here. Is somewhere on social media. I'm saying these are people that are in, I guess, that say this, and I'm going, well, hey, freedom of speech. They can think that all day long. Go ahead, go with God, think it. You can even say it to me because you have the right to say it in person. But when you're floating that out there to however many hundreds versus their friends versus whatever, and you've got that one, all right, hundreds of delusional souls out there who would go, there's an idea. I mean, how is that not considered?
So, I mean, this certainly can't be policed, right? The content that you it is, right? The content that you spread and information.
This is what I'm saying. I mean, how is that not a thing? Yeah, how's somebody not getting a knock on the door the next day going, couldn't help but notice these words popped up?
So, I mean, you'll see, so for example, and the companies themselves can take action, right? So Twitter, for example, did shut down accounts from Russian bots in 2016, right? So the company itself can take action, but certainly in those instances, law enforcement can step in.
And I'm not talking about hardcore censorship, or I'm not talking about diminishing freedom of speech. I'm literally asking a question: has something changed that makes that not a thing anymore?
So let me keep going a little bit, because I'll maybe enlighten a little bit about the context where we see more incivility. And so among politicians, so now we're switching back to what my colleague and I call the supply side, so those supplying information. When we think about politicians tweeting or sharing things on Facebook or other social media platforms, we can think about this in two ways. One is a broadcasting strategy, which is to say, if I were broadcasting today on my Twitter, I'd say, I'm appearing today at the League of Women Voters Luncheon to speak about social media and politics. If I'm engaging in my style, maybe I'm tweeting back the live tweets that transpired here and saying, hey, thanks for inviting me out and look forward to the next time, and I'm tweeting back to some of you. Now, in a normative sense, and kind of what we would want to see sense, we kind of like the idea of social media. Back again to Pamela's astute comment, this is an opportunity for politicians and us to interact in ways that previously would have been difficult. We couldn't call a politician on the phone. We couldn't show up at the office and hope for a meeting. But here I could tweet, and someone might respond back to me. So that seems like a positive attribute of Twitter. What I'm going to tell you is that style of engagement is actually one that introduces to the politician more incivility, right? So when the audiences know a politician is paying attention, and that's usually through the use of more engaging tweets, what we've seen from a creative study in 2014 of European parliamentary elections is that those tweets engender further incivility. And so this is kind of this Theocritus and co-authors, Barbera and others, harvested the tweets from all these candidates in European parliamentary elections. Some of them are well-known people, others not so well-known. They looked at their level of engaging tweets. In a place like the UK, there were quite a few engaging tweets across politicians. One person almost entirely tweeting engaging tweets. One person not doing any, just doing broadcasting, right? Greece had the least kind of by country of engaging style tweets. A quite variety of them. And then Germany, some, maybe not as much as the UK. If a politician engaged in these used these more engaging tweets, on average, they were more likely to attract incivility in response to them. Yes?
I'm very confused.
Okay.
What is an engaging tweet?
Engaging tweet, again, is where I'm replying back to, so say that you tweeted to me and said, at Philip Habel, hey, thanks for coming out today, and I reply back to you and say, hey, it was my pleasure. That's engaging. If I just tweet, if you tweet at me and I just tweet, I was at the luncheon today, and I never respond or reply or write a tweet directed to someone, I'm just broadcasting.
And so people actually do that?
Yeah.
Obviously, I'm not on Twitter.
Right. So again, like you think about if you're on Facebook, have you ever commented, like someone's post, commented on a post? That's engaging. If you're just writing your own Facebook status update and said, I attended a wonderful luncheon today, that's a broadcasting style. And the point is, if I'm more engaging as a politician, which we normatively think is a good thing, we want our politicians to respond to us, I invite more incivility, right? Which, yes?
So politicians and business leaders and whatever hire staff that do nothing but tweet for them.
Right?
So how do you know a tweet is a real response from the person you're trying to tweet with, or is just somebody being paid $12 an hour to tweet?
So that's a really good question. I'll tell you how academics have tried to address this. One of the earliest studies of President Trump's Twitter usage was actually looking at, so in Twitter, underneath kind of the shell is a whole bunch of what we call metadata, information about, so for example, if I tweeted from today, it would show my location, right? Okay, so one of the interesting things I found from President Trump early on, when he was, now it's principally just him tweeting, we know that, right? But early on, staffers were tweeting or they were coming in. It was dependent on the device and the time of day. And so you can actually identify which tweets were from the president based on time of day and device in combination from one another. So there are maybe creative ways, but you're absolutely right. A lot of members of Congress especially will hire professional staffers to do their communication, and part of that is social media, right? But at local and state levels, a lot less common, right? There's less resources, there's less, you might have a person who helps with your communication, but you might be doing a lot of the tweeting yourself. So it depends a bit on the level. Good. Okay, so let's, I'm going to just do a couple last slides, not quite last slides yet, but I'm going to wrap up this conversation on fake news, bots, censorship, polarization, incivility, with maybe some encouraging news. It depends on how you look at this. And that is, at the end of the day, when it comes to the choices we make in the voting booth, again, you can see this is for better or for worse, most of what we do is driven by our partisanship. And so exposure to fake news and information, exposure to incivility, exposure to these things might anger us and upset us, but it's unlikely that exposure to fake news is going, for most of us, is going to get us to change our mind. If anything, we might impugn the opposition and say, oh, these, Republicans, these Democrats, all they do is share fake news and information, but it's not changing our own minds for better or for worse. Most of us still make decisions politically based on our partisanship. If something slips through the cracks, if we get exposed to a lot of fake news and we start going, hey, I wonder if there's any truth to this, oftentimes those with whom we discuss politics bring us back to the fold. They say, don't believe that, that's not true. Our choice, our politician's good, And so, let me give you an example of this. Again, it depends on how you see this. I think you'd all say that a lot's happened in the Trump presidency since January of 2019, right? I mean, there's been a tremendous amount that's gone on since January of 2019, and yet if you ask approval ratings based on partisanship, you're going to notice surprising, right, levels of similarity across time. Among Republicans, approval ratings are typically 87 to as high as 91%, right? Across this whole last 10 months of the presidency. Among Democrats, well, we hit double digits once. Back in April, it was 12% approval for President Trump. Most of the time, it's been single digits. Of late, it's been down to 5, but it's also been 5 back in January as well. Most people who are interested and active and engaged in politics are partisans, and they filter and screen information through that lens of partisanship, be it fake news, be it incivility, and the like. Let's talk about one last thing, and then I'll leave you because I don't want to go too long. But let's talk a little bit about political participation. Lastly, does social media get people more active? Right. This is a conversation here. So are we concerned about the quality of information? Maybe. Right. How about just the very are people encouraged? Is it liberating? Do people turn out to vote more? And certainly we've seen an expansion of the definition of how we think about participation thanks to social media. It isn't just the kind of classic voting, giving money to a campaign, or what scholars have in the past called unconventional protesting or boycotting. Today we can tweet, we can share, we can watch news and information, and talk. We've got all these options available to us. I'll show you one really interesting experiment on Facebook. A group of scholars working in partnership with Facebook embedded in 2012 the following message on randomly assigned to users' Facebook pages. And you may see that this looks familiar because they've been doing it in elections since then. At the top of your Facebook feed will be an informational message. Today is election day. Find your polling place. Click I voted to show that you voted, right? And maybe you've done this in recent elections because it's been there. Right? They also, so some users saw no message at all. This is back in 2012. Some users saw this message at the top of their Facebook page. Several 100,000 then saw this message, which also showed your friends' activity. And what they found is that, no surprise, with the friends' activity, there was a slight uptick in turnout. Not huge. We're talking, if these were close friends, about a 2% increase, but an increase. So, can social media sites be used to harness good and encourage participation? Certainly the social aspect of it communicates to us what our friends are doing, and we look at that and might say, hey, if my friends voted, maybe I should do the same. All right, so I'm going to just end here now and say the summary of the work more generally on participation is the following. Most studies will find that those who use social media more often are more likely to participate politically. That's across the board, that is a true finding. However, there's a big caveat. The role of political interest is a key moderator. If I take away someone's political interest, the relationship between social media and participation falls apart. So in other words, if I'm interested in politics and I use social media, I am especially likely to participate. I am more likely to participate than someone who's just interested in politics. Social media. But if I'm not interested in politics, whether I use social media or not is not going to have any appreciable difference on my participation. All right, I thank you for your time. I had more, but I think it's a good time now for some of the questions and answers, and then I'm happy to take a few minutes. Yes, please.
Do you have any studies on the age group that's tweeting? And are there any studies between tweeting and letter writing? Say if you wrote a letter, they counted in the congressional office, they counted that as 10 people with that opinion. So how is Twitter stacking up?
Yeah, so it's, the young people are still more apt to use social media than the elderly. Some of the platforms that they're using are changing. The ways in which young people use social media for political purposes is coming back to that idea of a more expansive definition of what we mean by political participation. If we're saying young people are voting more often than the elderly, no, right? That's still true. Young people are less likely to turn out in an election, but are they more likely to kind of tweet and engage? Yes, in certain contexts. And two things I'll say about that. Back to fake news, not only was there this relationship between ideologues, but elderly were more likely to share fake news. Young people maybe see through it, are more apt to kind of understand it or ignore it. The age group most likely to share fake news was 65 and older. So there's a great study published by the same set of authors called "The Kids Are All Right." Good, thanks. So that answers? Okay. Yes?
I guess there's no telltale signs of something that is from a bot, or is there something like?
Okay, so again, a really great question. We're trying to. So one of the studies that has looked at this is, let me give a short answer. Bots have gotten increasingly sophisticated. So early on, we could kind of tell what looks like a bot because it would just kind of, again, I just tweeted something and all of a sudden I get a bot responding to me saying, but now, you know, as particularly as entities, kind of back to this idea of tumultuous technology, as entities are getting smarter, they're able to disguise bots in ways that are making it harder for us to identify whether they are bots or not. So that is an alarming kind of trend. You've heard about maybe you've heard about this rise of like deep fakes, right? The same idea that you can kind of alter someone's image in such a way that it looks like they're saying something that they're not, right? It's that same kind of narrative concern. So the short answer is, we as academics, as scholars, as government entities studying this, we're always kind of playing catch up because the technology is changing quickly.
I just remember a lot of stuff that was like, that was just there and then it was gone. You know, some outlandish story about somebody or something, you'd see it, and then they'd take it away. Sometimes it would mostly be on, that's where I would find things on Facebook, but sometimes it would bleed over into the news sites, and then it would just disappear. The story would, and so I don't know if that was then being discovered or what.
Yeah, I think that's probably a sign that maybe, are we out of time? Probably, yes. Okay, thank you all. I really appreciate your time. I'm happy to take more questions after too. Thanks.